Hey everybody, welcome to our talk. Thank you so much for staying till the end of the day. Hopefully you'll find a lot of good stuff from our talk today. But let's get in. We've been working on app monetization strategies for a really long time. And we've helped a lot of developers create a balanced ad experience that's balanced with your user experience. And that's what's the most important thing we want you to take away today is the balance with the user experience. And in fact, we do have case studies that show that our kind of strategies do work for folks. We have apps that have been increasing their revenue by 35%, sometimes even 4x by using, yeah, it's huge, by using some of the strategies that we're going to talk about today or that we've talked about before. But it's also one of these things to make sure that you know that ads and making money off your app isn't a dirty word. It's okay to use ads in your app if you're making sure that your users are happy and they're still engaged. And what's really cool and why we're so excited to be here today is because a lot of these tools are now available for Flutter, and so that Flutter developers can now take advantage of these same types of tools.
So let's maybe start by introducing ourselves. You just a bit right into the topic, but I'm Barış. I lead Google's App Analytics and Growth team in the EMEA region with the AdMob team, and I'm coming from Dublin, Ireland. So happy to be with you all today.
And I'm Rachel, and I'm on Firebase, and I work on the developer relations team, and I'm actually located in the Stockholm office, so right across the way.
Whoops. Okay, so let's take a look at today's agenda. We'll be first focusing on the covering different kind of monetization concepts and discuss a bit on hybrid monetization. Then we will be going through a framework that has been really successful with native app developers and also Unity developers that we've worked in the past. And then we will show you how to configure everything in Flutter, because now it all works with Flutter. And then we will wrap up with the summary and also give you a few resources to move on further if you are interested in the topic and monetize your apps, optimize your apps on the monetization aspect. So let's first jump in with the hybrid monetization. You might know that there are different types of monetization strategies in the app business, in the app ecosystem. You might be requesting your users to pay the premium before downloading the app. You might be making your app for free, but then expect users to monetize the app through either in-app purchases or ads. And there's a balance in finding all of them. But before we jump into actually like covering some of these topics, can I see a raise of hands who, if any of you have tried to monetize your apps? Great. And can I see a raise of hands who tried monetizing apps with in-app purchases? And the raise of hands for the ads?
Sweet. Okay.
Okay,
cool.
That's a good bunch. So just wanted to emphasize one thing, that when it comes to monetizing apps, oftentimes in-app ads is considered as the last option, last user-friendly option. And there is value in that. Like, it's a really tough business to actually balance user experience with monetization. But I just wanted to highlight here that according to the Statista report, ad monetization has been the significant revenue driver across all of these different monetization strategies. And ads monetization is expected to grow by 48% in the next 4 years, which is a lot. And there's a lot of opportunity here if you haven't really considered using ads. But before we jump into this hybrid monetization, let's actually explore a bit on the user behavior in the app. So users are the most important factor when it comes to an app business, because at the end of the day, they're the ones spending time in the app, and they are the ones engaging with what's going on. So if we were to put users in a spectrum of cannot pay to has paid in an app, we would most likely to see in an average freemium app that 5% of the users are making in-app purchases. Now, this number might look a bit small in terms of percentage-wise, but when we take a look at the revenue that they drive, in-app purchase revenue coming from this small percentage of users is actually pretty significant. However, if we just shift our focus from these 5% of users who make in-app purchases into the 95% of users who might be under-monetized or not monetized at all, there's a huge revenue opportunity lying with ads, because ads work in volumes. The more users are seeing impressions, the more ads revenue would compound. And rather than focusing on either in-app purchases or ads, actually it might be a good idea to combine them both. but in a more elegant way than rather than providing one-size-fits-all approach. Now, today we're going to be talking about how to configure your app to choose the best monetization option depending on user preferences. And the example that we will follow is depending on a user state, whether they're a purchaser or not. So we will simply be focusing on this simple characterization of the user, and we will stop serving ads to any user who is a purchaser, and we will serve ads for the users who are not purchasers. The logic behind this is when a user makes a purchase in an app, chances are they will come back to the app and make a recurring purchase.
They will.
But for the remaining group of users who are not purchasers, we don't want them to go under monetized, so we will be showing them ads. Now, this is a very simple setup, and if you were to go a little bit further, you can actually throw in more elements of like time-based structure or maybe other kind of rule sets, all configurable within the Firebase console UI. But we will be actually talking a bit more on the initial concept.
Yeah, because this is actually one of the better experiences that you want to have for your users who are welcoming into your app, with a warm onboarding to make sure that they're not like shocked right away with ads, and that you make sure that you capture whether or not they're a purchaser or not. And so this is really what you want to set up in your app. And one of the things is since we're going to keep this simple, this setup is going to be in a written tutorial that you can access later. So make sure you check back later this week, maybe next week it'll be published. But this is actually what you do want to set up after you consider everything that you learned today.
So let's go step by step and focus on the simpler case, introduce all components, put it all together. And then, as Rachel mentioned, if you want to follow through the more sophisticated case, it will be available later on as a tutorial. So we just said we're gonna check if a user is a purchaser or not. We're not gonna show them an ad if they're a purchaser, and we're gonna present ads if they're not. So how do we actually achieve that? Now, we're going to be relying on a few components: Google AdMob, Google Analytics, and Firebase. And that's the framework that's basically worked for native developers or Unity developers. And now this is all applicable with Flutter. So let's first take a look at Google AdMob. Google AdMob is Google's ad monetization platform, which actually lets you allocate some space in the app. And then it basically tries to find the highest bidder for the inventory by utilizing the plugged-in ad networks, depending on the criteria that you might have set, like frequency or ad format. And speaking of ad formats, I'm sure you kind of encountered one or many or maybe all of these ad formats in your day-to-day application use. But there are different use cases where each of these ad formats could be beneficial.
And I just want to jump in here. We talked about that we had other strategies to be able to test out. We actually have a tutorial and a bunch of videos that you can figure out how to use these different ad formats and where their strengths and weaknesses are to make sure you're still engaging your users while using these different types of formats. So if you want to learn more about AdMob in that way, there's resources out there for you.
That's a great call out. But for this session, we will not be focusing on choosing the right ad format, but rather we will be focusing on whom to show ads or whom not to show ads. So let's take a look at the next component that would allow us to do that, which is Google Analytics for Firebase. So Google Analytics basically allows you to collect information about users on what's happening in the app. And you can then then analyze this data to find behavior patterns. And we will be actually focusing on two main components of Google Analytics. The first one is Google Analytics events. When you integrate the Google Analytics SDK to your app, Google Analytics starts to collect some of the default events that users might be triggering. And if you are more interested in finding out what's happening in your app specific to your app, then you can always go ahead and log your own events. But for the sake of this run-through, we will be actually focusing on the events that are associating a user with being a purchaser. And we will actually be making use of the in-app purchase event that we see here to proceed further. The next component in Google Analytics, which is the second powerful component that we are utilizing, is Google Analytics audiences. So each of your users is different and takes different actions in your app. And we just want to categorize these users based on their characteristic of being a purchaser or not. And when presented with the opportunity of purchasing an ice cream, you might see that the Dash just jumped right into the opportunity, got his ice cream. But you might realize that Sparky didn't really get a chance to buy ice cream because, you know, fiery guy, ice cream, like he will miss the opportunity to even get a bite. So at this point, we have two distinct user groups as purchaser and non-purchaser, and we will be then focusing on how to configure different kind of setups for these user audiences utilizing Firebase. Yep. Take it away, Rachel.
Yeah. So as we said earlier, I work on Firebase. So we're at a Firebase conference. So we're going to assume that you all know quite a bit about Firebase. But we're also at a Flutter conference. So we kind of maybe think that maybe most of you are more familiar with our backend services, things like Firestore, functions, things like that. But Firebase actually has a really large group of products that are all about understanding and engaging your users. And today we want to make sure you know about a product called Remote Config. How many of y'all have used Remote Config before? Excellent. Who has never heard of Remote Config in your life? Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to speaking to you. We're going to go at a really high level. There's actually another talk tomorrow that's going into more features of Remote Config, but we're going to kind of go on a really high level of Remote Config just to be able to make sure to reinforce these, this use case that you can build on. So, Remote Config. Well, it's used to configure your app to serve different experiences to groups of users based on a common characteristic. And that common characteristic feature should be really be harkening back to what Barış said about Google Analytics audiences. Because Remote Config can actually serve different types of experiences to your users based upon their audience. And it does it in a really good way. It does it dynamically. You can avoid hard coding values in your code if you start using Remote Config, because Remote Config fetches values dynamically from the cloud. And oftentimes these values are based upon a user's audience. And your app's logic can then use these values to serve up different types of experiences. And in this example, ice cream versus pizza. Because, Barış, Dash might like ice cream, but if you don't know this already, Sparky loves his pizza. And so, if we had served up a more customized experience using Remote Config, we would have turned Sparky into a purchaser, and he would have bought that pizza. But since we didn't, he's going to be thrown into the non-purchasers audience, and he's going to be served up an ads experience instead. And another cool thing about the values stored by Remote Config is that they're stored in the cloud. That means that you do not have to re-release your app to be able to update anything. You can update these values anytime you want because they're in the cloud. You don't have to re-release a new version of your app just to update a simple value. So now that we know about all the ingredients, we have AdMob, we have Google Analytics, and we have Firebase. Let's put them all together and make sure we know how they all work and how we configure them to make sure that we get everything set up right and working together. So we don't want to go in the nitty-gritty detail of connecting everything, registering everything, but there is some things that you need to do to set things up. But because this is Flutter, these are the Flutter plugins that you'll need for the product. So these are all now available in Flutter, as we said before. But let's go back to that decision tree to make sure we know how this looks really simple and oh, we're just going to do this flipping on anything. But there's a lot of behind the scenes magic that happens here in the app and in your code. And we want to make sure we kind of pull back that curtain from the magic so that you understand how everything kind of fits together. So we have this full workflow. First thing that happens is a user launches your app. And as soon as they launch that app, you want to make a call to fetch and activate in Remote Config because you want the most up-to-date values, you want the most up-to-date config that's available for that user because you want to serve the most customized experience for that user as soon as possible. And when you make that call, you're going to send some information about the user, about the device, up into the cloud. And Google Analytics is going to use that information to say, hey, what audience is this user in? And for our case, it's whether or not they're a purchaser or not, something really simple. But Google Analytics is going to send that information over to Remote Config, and Remote Config is going to push the relevant config back down to the app in the form of parameters. And parameters are just key value pairs. And the value is going to be specific to whatever audience they were in. And your app's code is going to run some logic based upon that value, and it's going to handle it in different ways. So in our example, our app's code is asking the question, hey, can I show ads to this user? And if the parameters value is returned as true, that means that you can go ahead and show ads because that user is a non-purchaser. They're not purchasing anything. You're going to monetize them using ads. However, if the parameters value shows up as false, that means the person is a purchaser. We want to keep them along that purchasing track. As Barış said earlier, they're probably going to make a purchase, so you don't need to show them ads. And so after that, you now have a distinct, customized user experience for your users. So we first, to get things kicked off, we actually need an ad to show to these people, to these non-purchasers. You do this in the AdMob UI, and it's a pretty straightforward workflow, pretty simple. But the main thing that you want to know is the ad unit ID. This is a unique identifier for this ad, this configuration, and you're going to need that ad ID to be able to implement it in your code.
I guess at this point, we would need to remember that since we are targeting Flutter, we would need to repeat this setup, these steps twice to get an ad unit ID for iOS and Android, right?
100%. Yep. So you're going to end up with two ad units, one for your iOS target, one for your Android target. So you're going to end up with two unique ad unit IDs. And so once you have those two ads, you're going to have to figure out who to show them to. Again, who you show them to is determined by Google Analytics. So you all know, you've probably seen it, maybe passed by it. In the Firebase console, there is a basic view of your analytics data. If you want more advanced analytics data, go over into the Google Analytics UI. But in the Firebase console, there is this basic view, and it has a list of your audiences too. And I want to focus in on this very last audience there, and it's called purchasers. This audience is actually automatically created for you by Google Analytics. If anyone in your app ever does an event or takes an action, that's one of those events that Barış was talking about earlier that signifies that they are a purchaser. And that audience will automatically get created for you, and you can leverage it right away. But there are a lot of other audiences in this list, and if you opened up your console, you would not see these audiences. These are actually custom audiences. And custom audiences are things that are segments that are important to you, to your app, to your business. And you can create custom audiences by just clicking that new audience button, and it pops up a nice little workflow, and you can create an audience that's specific to your use case. So one of the examples we talked about earlier was all those different decision trees of like how long your users had been in your app. So like if they're a non-purchaser that's been in your app for less than 3 days, 3 to 6 days, over 6 days, those are all individual audiences that you'd want to create so that you can target each one of those groups with a very customized experience.
All configurable with that little button over there.
I know, it's great. So let's look at the purchasers audience. And we're going to use this in Firebase Remote Config, like we said. And we're going to use it to create what's called a conditional parameter. It's really quite simple. It's just kind of like a if it applies, if it doesn't. We kick it off by creating a condition that considers whether the user is in that purchaser's audience from Google Analytics. And then we define the parameter, the key value pair that we're going to send down to the app. And the value of that parameter is going to depend upon that condition that we just set up. And Remote Config is going to send that value down to your app. And your app's going to know whether to show ads or not in our use case. But you can configure these in a lot of different ways to make them as complex as you kind of want. And you'll notice that in this example, our parameter's name is add control switch. It's just a really simple Boolean switch because we're just going to turn ads on or off because they're a purchaser or not purchaser. Just keeping it kind of simple in this session. And the parameter's default value is going to be true because our logic is asking, hey, can I show ads? By default, we're going to say true. But if the user is in the purchasers group, we're going to say, hey, nope, false, don't show ads. This person, we want to keep them on that purchaser's route. And in the next slides, this is a developers conference. We aren't going to show you just a bunch of console UI flows because you actually do have to hook this up into your code. And so here, there's a couple little things you got to do to instantiate everything, but the meat of a lot of this stuff is that your remote config needs to be able to pull down the most up-to-date configs and values. And like we said earlier, remote config operates on a fetch model. So it's going to pull those things down with a fetch and activate call. And you might be asking right now, I've been saying it's pulling this stuff from the cloud. But what if my app, it doesn't have access to the cloud? Maybe it's offline, or you have a response timeout or something like that. You do, unfortunately, need to make sure you still hard code some things into your app. You want to make sure that nothing crashes and something doesn't have a value. So there is some hard coding still that we recommend that y'all do. But when your app does successfully get this config from the cloud, which it usually does, then you can run code that's dependent upon that config. Specifically, in this example, we're going to load some ads, or not. And so whether or not we load up those ads, again, depends on that ad control switch parameter and what its value is. And we're going to get that value of the parameter from the remote config instance. And we're going to capture it in a variable that we're going to call show ads. Again, logic is, can I show ads?
So I guess we are now making use of the ad unit IDs that you were explaining when we were going through the AdMob UI. But one thing that I don't quite get is we just describe parameterization of values rather than hard coding, but we're still hard coding the ad unit IDs. Could this also be improved?
Oh, totally. Yeah. So this is just to be able to show it in the code. And you'll actually see in the AdMob examples, this is what they do because they're not, like in the AdMob docs, that's what they do because they're not using remote config. If they were using remote config, then they would parameterize those in a parameter of remote config, because you want to make sure that you can do your conditional statements for showing which ad at that level so that you can change these values on the fly. You don't have to hard code them into your app. So yeah, this is another example of where you can parameterize up in remote config rather than in your code. But one thing about this, now that you bring it up, the Android and iOS Flutter apps can also target web. But AdMob is only for mobile apps. So make sure that if you do this, that you put up some extra guards so that your app doesn't fail if it's making that request from the web app.
For targeting web. Gotcha.
Yeah, definitely. And finally, our logic will execute and it'll serve the ad unit, but only if that parameter's value is true, saying, hey, go ahead and serve these ads. This person's a non-purchaser. It's false. It's going to shut everything down right here and not show ads and send them on a different type of journey that's more customized to them.
And that's it for the whole setup. Like, are we all set to just utilize the workflow that we had in mind?
Yeah, make sure you release your app because this is app code, so it does have to go out to your users. It can't just sit there on the console. So make sure you release your app. But yeah, 150 lines of code, something like that.
Okay, that was pretty straightforward. Yeah. Thanks for walking us through. And before we close, I just wanted to let you know of the key takeaways for this session. First of all is ad revenue works in volumes, so don't miss out on significant revenue opportunities if your paying users are only a certain percentage of your app. The second one is no user is the same, so we just followed an approach mostly focusing on monetization strategies, but obviously you can utilize the same type of approach to customize the user experience of your users to maybe differentiate their onboarding experiences or different kind of experiences in the app. And finally, if you were to combine these first two learnings together, segmenting users and targeting them are really easy with Firebase. And Rachel walked us through how to achieve this in Flutter. This can help you basically deliver specific experiences for specific users, making them happier users and maybe more optimized monetization for you. And before we leave the stage, here are some resources that you can take a look at. Rachel was mentioning some of the case studies or the tutorials that we have published in the past. All of them are accessible here. And one of them is highlighted with light orange, which is optimizing hybrid monetization, which is actually this session. So we will be wrapping up this session content in a nice tutorial, easy to follow step by step. So you would be able to access it.
Yeah. And I think we also wanted to mention that the more advanced setup is going to be in the next, probably next week or so. So check back if you see the basic implementation this week, and then next week look out for the more advanced configuration.
Yeah, that's a great call out. And with that, thank you for being with us, and we hope to we hope that you would be able to balance your UX and monetization using Flutter and Firebase.